Thanks for coming. This is our first in a series of new lunchtime talks where we invite key figures in London's contemporary art scene to discuss where they see contemporary culture is now. And today we're very pleased to be joined by Mark Titchner and Tim Marlow. Tim Marlow is the Director of Exhibitions at the White Cube and writer and broadcaster, and is also on the council here at the ICA. I'll let him introduce Mark, but please give them a warm welcome.
Mark, thanks very much for agreeing to kick this off. I don't think you need much of an introduction, but I'll give you one. I love the fact that Mark, although he was born in England, born in Luton and went to St Martin's Central St Martin's School of Art, actually was shown in the Ukrainian Pavilion in Venice in 2007. So one of the things we might talk about is national identity. He was nominated for the Turner Prize in 2006. He currently has a work on the rehang, or rather the relaunch of the South London Gallery, but is shown in numerous museums and institutions, not least the Baltic. We asked Mark to kick off this taught conversation, slightly unfairly, by asking him if he could produce a work that had been produced in the 21st century that had struck a chord with him, that had an impact on him. Because we thought we'd like to throw a kind of spanner in the works rather than ask him to tell us how he got started as an artist, which we may do later on. And so that's where we're going to begin. And as is always the case with Mark, do you think you have a sense of what his work or practice is about? But at the same time, there's always this idea of a slight spanner in the works. And I think that's probably evident in the work that you've chosen, because it's... well, I should let you explain what it is, Mark. Yeah.
That wasn't intentional. When I was asked to sort of think about choosing a very recent work to talk about, it's actually I found it quite difficult to think about something from the last 10 years in terms of how it influenced me. I found that quite difficult. I think it would have been very easy to sort of choose sort of kind of classic sort of conceptual work or work from the 80s, and so in a way, when I was looking for a work, I wanted something which was reflected my interest in sort of history, I suppose, or the sort of 20th century history, and I chose a work by a New Zealand artist called Michael Stevenson, which is called The Fountain of Prosperity. Hopefully. Sorry, there we go. This is it's a piece from 2006 called The Fountain of Prosperity. Michael, as I mentioned, is from New Zealand. He lives and works in Berlin, and his works normally have. He quite often looks at the identity of New Zealand, but really is a kind of metaphor for how. Race and nationality and all of these export and imports work, and what this is it's a replica of a machine designed by a New Zealander called Bill Phillips in the 1950s, which was basically a computer that used water to make complex economic forecasts. It's what interested me about it really is there's a whole kind of complex story about why he chose to do this, but I liked in the end that it ended up as a sculptural object, so it's a kind of methodology that I was interested in. The idea that he almost starts off with research or a story, and he ends up with a kind of quite bizarre object. Basically it has a series of valves and inlets, almost like organs, and that metaphor is kind of extended because Bill Phillips, who originally developed the machine, used to like to put red dye in the water that ran round it, so it had its kind of own bloodstream. And when Michael exhibits it, he kind of lets it do its own thing. So during the exhibition, this sort of economic cycle that starts off healthily gradually goes wrong because it needs almost constant kind of adjustment, and it kind of entropy kicks in, and it just goes into this kind of like economic meltdown, as it were. Just to show you a different view of it. So this Shall I say a bit more about this work?
Yeah.
Okay, because it's a little bit of a story to it. So 15 of these machines were designed in the 1950s by this guy, Bill Phillips, and he was a student at LSE here, and it was a response to Keynes's economic drawings, which were quite often used kind of flow diagrams, and this is like literally kind of extruding these diagrams out into 3 dimensions. And at the time, it was quite a remarkable piece of machinery and one of the most advanced economic calculators that were available. And they produced 15 copies of it and exported them around the world. A gentleman in America, here he is, who marketed it, decided that he would change the name of the machine from the Philips machine to the more catchy Moniac, which is what he sold it as. He did have it was going to be called the Nymph because of the water element, but he decided on the Moniac. When Michael was researching this and looking at where the machines went, he discovered one of them got sent to Guatemala in 1954 and bought by the central bank there rather than an educational establishment. It actually went to a bank, so it was being used by the government of Guatemala to make these kind of calculations. Around this time, there was, I suppose, 2 contradictory forces in economics, one being a kind of completely sort of free market, as it were.
Chicago School.
Exactly, and the other being this idea that particularly the tropics and the sort of ex-colonial countries could be aided in developing by themselves. Guatemala had at the time the Arbenz government in place, which was a kind of communist, socialist kind of government, and there was a major schism, I suppose, with the biggest business in the country, which was United Fruits, whose big business was, although they controlled the roads and the railways and the ports, was bananas. Told you it was a story. So basically, this work that Michael made, and I'll just skip back to that, is exhibited as part of a larger exhibition called Some Truths to Some Difficult Questions About Bananas, which is the name of a film that was made by, produced by Edward Bernays. Edward Bernays was the nephew of Sigmund Freud, but he basically started what we now know as the kind of modern advertising and propaganda kind of industry. And he made this film, Some Truths About Bananas, which was a kind of very bizarre anti-communist film about the banana industry, kind of explaining why it was good to eat bananas and why it was good to produce bananas, and entirely funded by the CIA, and part of the mechanism that began to get rid of the Arbenz government, which happened a couple of years later, and replace it with a military kind of regime. So this machine kind of, when it arrived in Guatemala, it kind of had a life as kind of a potential hopeful kind of idea of Guatemala and how it might become. It kind of became redundant and literally became retired and disappeared into a vault, and no one knows where it exists. So I think this kind of rather decrepit, I like the idea, it sort of suggests, it's an archaeological work as such, and it suggests a kind of future that didn't really come to pass. I like the kind of idea of it as a circulation system and as a body that's kind of folded in on itself and ceased to function. And also the very literal fact that it is a fountain, and the sort of, obviously Duchamp's fountain is the kind of beginning of the ready-made, and this in a way being a kind of complex version of that much further kind of down the line.
I think it's really interesting because that is a complicated saga, beautifully told, by the way. And I don't want to be over-reductive and therefore apply everything to your work or practice, but I think it is very revealing that is the kind of work that you're drawn to, and it's that kind of layering or levelling. The first thing I wanted to pick up, though, was as you were describing the work, pataphysics, which was this science of no solutions. Is that something that's certainly referred to in this work? Is that something that you are interested in your own work?
think I'm drawn to it, but I tend to be quite cynical of the idea of things being not so much the things themselves being knowable or unknowable, but just that kind of drive to do that. I kind of, if that makes sense. Like I try to sort of
have works that are open-ended rather than closed.
Well, the problem is this might all seem very strange because I suppose like a lot of the work that I do is very blunt in a way, but that comes out of, I mean, in relation to this work, that really comes out of the work of someone like Bernays, which is to do with actually applying psychological precepts to advertising, and a lot of what I do comes out of the consequences of several generations of that happening now. So I work very much from the point of view that you have any object has to have if I'm making work which is about media or relative to the media and advertising, has to have an impact which is similar to the advertising and media, which basically means that you have to be able to look at it and understand it in 2 seconds, or at least to look at it and feel engaged with it in 2 seconds. And then, once you've kind of pulled someone in, then you're able to start kind of playing around with the fact that things perhaps don't add up to exactly what you think they are on the surface. So there's a slight, that it's almost a desperation. I mean, to be honest, the reason that I started working with text at all was just very simply because this exchange that we have, when you see a word written on a wall, you read it and it's internalised, and that's not sort of, judgment comes later. And I think that internalisation, that point of reception is an incredibly sort of powerful one, because all of the kind of intellectual filters go down and you kind of let something into you. So everything just stems from that kind of, that moment really.
You've recently made a series of works out to be shown outdoors. I mean, you've done that before, where the words are broken. So you don't see the words in their entirety. You have to read through the letters on different levels in order to make the words actually make sense. That's not necessarily a new idea, but it seems very interesting in the context of your work, because that isn't immediate, is it? It's something to be decoded. Is that, and that also, I think, relates to a piece like this, the idea of trying to make sense of something, or a kind of tease or a mystery, and the human impulse always to try and bring sense to everything. You're playing with that consciously in the recent work. Has that always been something that's interested you?
Yeah, I mean, with the those recent pieces, it's partly just to make that act of reading slightly more problematic. So you're having to think a little bit about. I tend to use really this most simple kind of language. I never use words which aren't. Words which I feel are complicated. Talk about something complicated, but try and pare it down to constituent parts. With breaking the words up, it was partly, like I say, to just make that act of reading a little bit more. You have to make a bit more of an effort to do this. It's partly just because I started, like, languages. There's of all kinds of theories around language, and some of the interesting kind of more esoteric ideas around language, which came from things like the Kabbalah, to do with the language like as units, as physical building blocks of matter, and the universe is composed of language. So it's a way also of thinking about words and letters as units which can be moved, broken and split up. And also it just means that if you say, for instance, one of the works you're talking about says we are everywhere, and you break the way that those words were broken down. It just was simple things like the word Eve would appear, or the word here would appear and concealed. And it's amazing to me that they seem really apparent, but people do take a minute to work out what they say. But I suppose it just reveals a little bit of the poetry of the work, and also allows for more possibilities in terms of typography and composition.
When you were initially making that decision to go to art school, and then the earliest work you were doing as a student, did language play a central part? Was that your initial motivation, or is it something that's slowly crept into your work to the point now where it's one of the dominant forces or medium?
I think everything I do has to do with language now in some form. I mean, I'll tell you this. I mean, when I arrived at St Martin's when I was 19, I used to come to see stuff at the Tate, but I didn't really know. We had one contemporary art book at school, which was a book called Technique Anglais, which was quite it's quite a strange book of artists.
Lynn Cook and Andrew Renton. There's a series of essays, wasn't it?
Yes, yeah.
And it was about that moment at the end of the 80s, at the beginning of the 90s.
Yeah, and it had quite uncharacteristic sort of works of people like Gary Human. It had like a piece where he'd coloured in sort of all the kind of, he'd got like kind of Arabic newspapers and coloured in kind of bits of them, really, and so I didn't really have any sense of what was what. And basically, I wanted to be Stanley Spencer. That was my thing. I was convinced that I could be the Stanley Spencer of Bedfordshire, and I could basically hang around the Arndale and sort of paint angels. And so when I arrived at St Martin's, I basically had this sort of crash course in, oh my God, there's like all this stuff I have no clue about, and just went into complete, going from wanting to be something very, very particular to not knowing at all what I wanted to be. And first of all, going through that process of like, okay, well, I'm a painter, I think, and then that kind of breaking down, and then starting to realise it could make anything, and getting really, really confused. And quite luckily, though not at the time, I got quite ill in the second year, so I had a lot of time off, and I just read, and it allowed me to sort of calm down a bit. And when I came back in the third year, I sort of was a bit more focused. But the words thing, whilst all this was going on, I'd always read books, and I'd always was the sort of person who'd make notes of quotations and pop lyrics and all of these things, but I never thought it had anything to do with my work. I just thought it was something that I did, just as a habit. And then also, when I think the very, very first art that I ever saw was comic books, which I used to use as colouring in books, and records. So immediately there's like text and image together. So that kind of stuff was all in there. But it took, I think, well, I was in the back garden at my mum's on Christmas Eve, I think 1999, and I literally just had this thought. I had a show coming up, and I thought I could write a word on the wall, and that was it. It just seemed, it had been kind of in the background for so long. I was making these big abstract wall drawings, and I was getting really frustrated with the fact that they were almost like wallpaper. I mean, I actually have done 2 of these here at the ICA over the years, where I used to paint my mum and dad's wallpaper. They had this horrible sort of silver op art wallpaper. I literally had got to the point where I was painting wallpaper, and I just thought, what happens if I write a word on the top of it? And suddenly, all of those notebooks with little quotations and stuff, which had been gathering for years, suddenly had a use. And I had all this source material, and it's just, I don't know, it's one of those moments where I felt really, really stupid, because it's been staring me in the face all this time, and I think that's probably the single biggest revelation I've had in my life, really.
Is there a sense, though, of trying on occasion to blur hierarchy? By which I mean, in these works, by which I mean, some of the quotes come from advertising, some of them are philosophical, some of them are from pop lyrics, some of them are kind of cliches from advertising, although there can be cliches from other areas too. You said you started with abstract design. You integrate letters and words as part of an overall design anyway. Obviously, it's up to the viewer to decide how they want to decode or make sense or engage with that work. But I have a work of yours, a lightbox piece, and I have a very young baby who's kind of grown up with this, and maybe it's because I'm starting to try and see it through different eyes. But there are moments when I don't read the words at all. It just appears as this extraordinary design, and then sometimes words appear, sometimes they don't. I mean, that's my response to it on occasion. Other times I'm very conscious of it, but it does seem very smart the way that you are able to blur this distinction. And words have always in the past tended to be given a higher status in our culture than abstract design.
Well, I think with those works there was always the idea, I mean, I have like literally, I suppose, started making those works as sculptures now, and they're sort of extruding outwards, so the material of the words and the material of the backgrounds all kind of mashed together. But the idea with those works really was to almost be like stained glass windows. So there's this sort of sense of just overpowering visual sensation, and that the images are kind of always, when I'm working on those kind of digital works, what happen? I start with a text. That's always what happens. Very rarely start with an image, but they normally, if they're not done after 2 days, they need to go in the bin, because it's just not happening. But the idea with those is just to reach this point where the image becomes sort of so oversaturated it almost breaks, but not quite. It's this kind of, like, I suppose in terms of art historical references, I'm really interested in
illuminated books.
Well, yeah, but I mean I was going to say Baroque art and that depiction of the ecstatic in Baroque religious art. Again, this sort of overload. Obviously, things like trade union banners and the propaganda, and also psychedelic art. And all three of those things have connections to sort of ideology, as it were, whether it's the ideology of communism or the ideology of like higher states of consciousness. And they all kind of, in a way, try to realise this aesthetically. So they kind of become slightly overwrought. And I think that's... I continue to be very much confused about what I believe I understand or what I believe to be true. And I think those frenetic kind of works are really about that kind of... I always talk about the idea of... this is a line from a song by Crass, which says, so much noise to make a silence. And it's kind of like that. What I'm trying to do really is almost just to negate everything, negate the words, negate the image, and you just end up with this kind of hiss, as it were, like static of images. And the problem of modern living, of everything coexisting in the same place at the same time, but trying to put it in an object. Like, I don't know, it's this sort of paradox.
Kind of extreme equilibrium, in a way. I was struck just then, you were using the word belief, and I never see you work again in the same light after you mentioned wanting to be the Stanley Spencer of Bedfordshire. But clearly belief systems are things that you have explored, and I think are continuing to explore in your work, belief systems, science, politics. But I'm curious about religion for you. I mean, do you have any religious beliefs yourself?
No, I mean, I don't. I mean, my mother's dad was a vicar, so I grew up around... I think it's an interesting thing that sometimes happens if you have a parent who's brought up by someone who is religious. They kind of go the other way, so we kind of didn't have any real religious kind of... I mean, I'm quite interested in... I'm interested in belief, but I don't have any sort of strong, particularly religious beliefs.
Do you think art is a belief system?
I think so, and this goes back to Michael's piece as well, because obviously, in the same way, this kind of system here, which is depicting a state of affairs, like a curve which is knowable in economics, is a kind of belief system, because it only kind of works as soon as it doesn't work. You know, as soon as you say, oh, actually, what would happen if we add this part to it? And obviously, economics, this belief in economics underpins everything, and we're kind of seeing the flip side of that in the last few years, when you can actually say, oh, actually, that is not a belief, that's an ideology, that's something slightly different. I think the great thing about art is that it's so expansive in what it can be, that it can become a belief system for the individual, which doesn't necessarily have to, on a very, very personal kind of basis. I mean, I think I feel lucky to be able to do something where I can basically just look at stuff that I'm interested in, whether it's occult esoteric stuff, or whether it's advertising, or whether it's music or literature. I just tend to, things that I'm interested in will end up in the work, and that's kind of
it's clear. I mean, there's a knowingness in talking to you about the way things are, and you used the word jaded earlier on about, or you're increasingly cynical about certain things, but I never sense that there's a kind of jadedness that has crept into or is creeping into your art. It's a difficultly framed question, actually, because I can do it in extremis, but and I'll have a go. Are you Do you still believe in the power of art without that seeming like a kind of sentimental or simplistic question? Does art seriously still seem to matter to you? Or does your experience of the world and the way that art is in the world and the impact it has or doesn't have, to some extent, reduce that as you get older?
I think there's two different things. There's sort of being an artist and being in the art world, and there's the feeling of... I think with art, it comes... if you go and see an exhibition or you go and see a work or and you look at it, and then when you leave you feel a sense of loss and you want to go back and look at it again, and you know that you're going to have to leave at some point, that feeling is a kind of... I don't really get that with anything else, and I'm not talking about... It's different than, say, with human relationships, because obviously you can't... You've got this little bubble of eternity, and you've also got all the kind of weird empathy with the artist, and there's all these impossible, weird things happening at the same time, and I think that... and in silence quite often as well. And I think that no matter how cynical I get about various things, when that happens, it's quite a moving... There was an exhibition at the Cumming Museum of an artist called Austin Osman Spare, who I'm a very sort of big fan of, and it was his first exhibition for 50 years, in kind of in a small municipal gallery off the Walworth Road, and found incredibly sort of emotional experience, and that's I don't know, it's hard to deny the power of those things when you experience it yourself. I don't know if... Obviously, with your own work, it's a different thing entirely. Don't have a lot of those, oh, yes, that was a magical day at the studio kind of things.
Are you an artist of routine? I mean, do you try and force yourself into some kind of routine, or do you work in a piecemeal way as and when the opportunity occurs, or you're happy to work in sort of phases of intensity?
I pretty much work in a sort of routine. I mean, I quite bad at, if I can sort of work, I will. So I sort of have to gradually wean myself off of just sort of staying in the studio all the time. Sort of slightly compulsive about things, especially if you're working on the computer. It's so easy to sort of pretend you're not working on the computer.
And I mean, you clearly have a wide range of interests, but the esoteric is something that does stand out. I'm not inviting you to put the boot into that generation of British artists that immediately preceded you, but do you feel connected to a British tradition? Does the post-YBA landscape, does it fill you with gloom? Do you feel attached to that? Do you feel in any way part of a British phenomenon, or are you conscious of working in a much more fragmented and international context? I think there's about 8 questions in there, but you get the gist of it.
Well, I mean, I think there's definitely a tradition, and I don't know whether I'm not saying that I'm in this, there's a tradition of artists, peculiarly British artists, that I'm really interested in, which come out of a sort of visionary tradition, and people like sort of William Blake and Samuel Palmer, right through to Spencer and Spare, as I mentioned, and people like John Latham, that I really, I think there are young artists working within that kind of tradition. I tend to think... I was in China last year, and with a show the British Council put on, which they used the text from one of my light boxes for the title for the show. It was called "The Future Demands Your Participation," and it was quite interesting how in China, how fascinated they are with the YBA generation still. Actually, the first question, I was sitting at the press conference with Alan Kane, and the first question was, is Damien Hirst coming to the opening? But I think you kind of understand it, because they saw across, if you're looking to generate a kind of global art identity and art scene, the YBA generation was a fantastic idea of how to sort of export that and how to represent it. Everyone knows what it is. It's like brand, and I'm quite interested in how... I think there's in the same way that at art school we kind of read the how New York stole the avant-garde from Paris. I think there's a book coming which will be about the connection between the YBAs and the rise of the kind of new Labour Party. So, you know, there's things, and also Saatchi's part of the whole phenomena as well. And I think I'm quite interested in that. I don't. Yeah, I don't know. I don't think about a lot of that work a lot. If you know what I mean.
But I'm also curious as to how inclusion in certain exhibitions, whether or not that has a significant impact, or whether it's just part of the job, for want of a better description. In other words, when you're part of a British Council touring show which explores the landscape of contemporary British art in a carefully curated, but also a kind of culturally imperialistic way, it's a great way of projecting around the world, or then you appear in that wonderful show that Michael Bracewell did at Tates and Dives that also toured, which was broadly speaking about the kind of occult and esoteric tradition in British art, the Dark Monarch.
But I think that was a really political show, because when I used to go to the Tate when I was a kid, it was all Nash and Sutherland and that kind of school of British art, and I didn't realise at the time, and Michael's show sort of drew this out, I thought, because he had a lot of less well-known British artists in that period, but those artists were intensely drawn into that whole post-war reconstruction of Britain and the Festival of Britain, and so that's
well. So, but broadly, so seeing yourself in that exhibition, or seeing yourself in a group show of British art in China, does it have a significant impact on the way you start to perceive yourself? Does it impact on what you might produce in the future?
I think there's definitely a sense of knowing how certain works could be used. I mean, I used a lot of sort of corporate slogans. I'm quite interested, or not so much now, but I have made works where I've used, in fact, the one that you have is a corporate kind of slogan, and I was interested in the time, this correlation between the language that Microsoft might have a corporate statement that says we want to nurture and protect, that in a way that's a kind of slogan that we might have 50 years ago to expected to have seen on a trade union banner, that movement of ideology, that in a way the free market has taken on elements of sort of socialism for its own kind of ends. So I think I know that those works can be misread quite easily. I mean, that example, the future demands your participation, I mean, that's actually a line from an Alistair Gray novel, and I liked it because to me it just really scared the crap out of me. It was just, I found it quite a terrifying, whereas I think in the context of the British Council, for them it becomes something much more inclusive. So I think I think with something like the British Council shows, perhaps that they reveal quite a lot about themselves anyway, because of the fact they are these kind of like survey shows of this is British art. I mean, you mentioned the Ukrainian piece. I mean, that was really interesting because I have no kind of connection, as it were, with Ukraine. It was an invitation, and at first I thought, well, this is a really strange thing. I thought it's actually, and then really, it's actually it's exactly the same problem. If you represent your country in whatever form, it's the same problem. You're presenting an image of them, and in a way, it's actually kind of more interesting to be abstracted from that and to sort of like try and. So what I did was work with a group of young artists in Ukraine on the text for that. So I kind of tried to do the same thing, which was like, okay, well, I've got this situation where I've been asked to make a work which is going to go outside of your national pavilion. I'm not from your country, and I actually don't know very much about it. So I'll give you the space, you come up with the text, I'll do the design for it. And that was part of the work, that was a big part of the work, really, because there was a whole lot of politics bound up in the fact, rightfully, a lot of the young Ukrainian artists were really angry about the fact that they kind of had been, they couldn't understand why, artists in the UK were showing in their pavilion.
So in a sense, that's a found text in a different kind of way. It's not something that you have found that struck a chord with you. It's a sense you're handing over a certain amount of control.
Well, it was kind of a conversation that we bounced things back and forth, and then also we had not censorship, but there was a certain we had another text which was kind of too tricky. That wouldn't.
You mean it was too provocative?
It referred directly to something which would have basically probably meant that the pavilion wouldn't have got funding.
Tell us what it said.
I can't remember, to be honest. It was actually it was a line from it was basically to do with the oligarch that had funded the pavilion.
Victor Pinchuk,
Victor Pinchuk, yeah, and the company which he'd sold. It was, all these weird things happened when the Iron Curtain came down. Some people suddenly owned all the oil in Russia, or all the steel in Ukraine. They call it non-transparent acquisition, and actually it's terrible. I really can't remember exactly what the text was, but it was a kind of subversion of one of their kind of corporate slogans, and they basically got it straight away that was what we were trying to do. It's all right if they don't. People sort of get it later. It's fine, but what's beforehand?
So we need to almost close up. But is subversion then something that interests you?
Well, it's a tricky one because I've done projects in the past where there's sort of boundaries. So I did something with Channel 4, as you know, like they had this idea that they wanted to build a big number 4 outside the headquarters, and which seemed rather showy to me, but
and very prescriptive.
Yeah, but I had this idea that basically when I first moved to London, Channel 4 had this program called Right to Reply, where you would go on into a little passport thing and you'd say, I don't like this program on Channel 4, or I do like this program, and then they would put it on. And it was around the time of all this, the Big Brother kind of racism row. And I had this idea that I would put this booth back underneath their big number 4 and then play back the videos that people had made on the surface of it. Now that's sort of all well and good, but the thing that really interested me was the fact, when I was researching this, there's this huge document that Ofcom produced, which all broadcasting has to go by, which basically says you can't do this, you shouldn't do this, down to minute detail. And I was really interested in the idea that if you have free speech, you have to have guidelines. So that thing which protects us also constrains us. And that's implicit within all television, or explicit within all television. So I wanted somehow to build that into it because it was a factor. So the idea, there was this sort of contractual element to it when you did it, which was basically like 3 buttons. But, if you press this button, you agree for this to kind of be aired, and also agreed for it to be edited to current standards of broadcasting. So basically, the footage goes into sort of Channel 4, gets sort of looked at and checked that it meets the kind of, and that to me that was the interesting part of the work. That little contract where you say, okay, well, I want to say something, but I don't actually know that what I'm going to say is going to come out quite the same, or what context it's going to be put into. But that's the ground that we work in, and I think it's always it's finding that little place. I think that little bit of tension, which is important. I mean, I suppose a lot of the time that may go completely unnoticed.
Do you think the world has become, or Britain, I think specifically, is the issue of censorship more acute than it was when you first started out as a professional artist, or is there not much of a change in that area?
I talked about this a few years ago at Liberty, the Civil Liberties Group, had a conference about arts, and I talked about this, and I was sort of saying the issue with censorship now, it's not to do with the Nan Golding photos at the Baltic, or it's not to do with those issues of nudity or religion or those traditional sacrilege. The issue with censorship is to do with the sort of disarming whole areas from being worthy of discussion. And the kind of, it's actually really interesting now because we're seeing a very, very mobilised student generation for the first time. But I think what I'm really bothered by is the fact that people don't make, or didn't make work which was ideological, anti-war, I don't know, whatever. They weren't anti censorship, or we just sort of, everything became very much about sort of surface and aesthetics and all those kind of things. And I think that deeper kind of sense of censorship is hopefully disappearing a bit now.
So you're more optimistic? The future is demanding a more engaged participation.
Well, I think it has to, doesn't it? I mean, I saw Jake Chapman last night, and he was telling me about this project they're doing, which is can't pay the fees, we pay the fines, which is basically a fund to help student protesters pay their legal fees, which again, I think it's good for people to sort of know that artists are part of a social framework, and have something to say, or I mean, whether you like what they say is another matter entirely, but it's better to say something than nothing.
It is, and it's good that you were prepared to come here and say as much as you have done. Mark Leckie, thank you. That would be a brilliant one.
That would be really good, wouldn't it?
Yeah, it would. Mark Titchner, thank you very much. Time. I've just been asked to remind you that if you want to come to the next in the series, next week is Grace and Perry. It's going to be streamlined on live. It is sold out, but there probably will be some seats if you turn up on the day. And the next one after that is Matthew Slotover. Okay, thanks.